In the heart of Hamburg, at the sprawling shipyards of Blohm and Voss, a behemoth was taking shape. This was no ordinary vessel. This was the birth of a titan, a ship destined to carve its name into the annals of naval history. This was the Bismarck. As the 1930s drew to a close, Germany, under the iron fist of Adolf Hitler, was rearming at a frantic pace, determined to shake off the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had severely limited the size of Germany's navy, but a new Anglo-German naval agreement in 1935 threw open the floodgates. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, was reborn. And at the heart of this rebirth was Plan Z, an ambitious naval construction program designed to challenge the supremacy of the British Royal Navy. The crown jewels of Plan Z were the Bismarck-class battleships. They were conceived not just as weapons of war, but as powerful symbols of German engineering, ambition, and defiance. The lead ship of this class, Bismarck, was laid down on July 1st, 1936. For nearly 3 years, the sounds of hammering, riveting, and welding filled the air as thousands of workers toiled to bring the steel giant to life. Piece by piece, plate by plate, the colossal hull grew, a testament to the immense industrial effort poured into its creation. It was a project of national importance, shrouded in secrecy but fueled by immense pride. On February 14, 1939, a grand ceremony marked the ship's launch. The atmosphere was electric. High-ranking Nazi officials, military leaders, and a massive crowd gathered to witness the spectacle. Adolf Hitler himself was present, his attendance underscoring the ship's significance to his vision of a new German empire. The ship's sponsor was Dorothea von Lohenfeld, the granddaughter of the legendary Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, the man for whom the ship was named. As she christened the hull, a bottle of champagne shattered against its steel plates, and the mighty vessel slid gracefully into the waters of the River Elbe. The crowd roared. The Bismarck, a floating fortress of over 41,000 tons, was officially born. But launching was just the beginning. The next year and a half were dedicated to the meticulous process of fitting out. This is where the ship truly came alive. Towering superstructures were erected, housing the bridge, command centers, and fire control directors. The ship's formidable armament was installed. The main battery consisted of 8 massive 15-inch guns, housed in 4 twin turrets named Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora. These guns could hurl armor-piercing shells weighing nearly a ton over 20 miles, capable of crippling any warship of the era. The secondary armament was equally impressive, with a dozen 5.9-inch guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and torpedo tubes, making Bismarck a threat from any distance, against any target. Below deck, a city of steel was taking shape. The heart of the Bismarck was its powerful propulsion system. 3 sets of Blohm and Voss, geared steam turbines, fed by 12 high-pressure Wagner boilers, gave the ship its immense power. This engineering marvel could generate over 150,000 horsepower, propelling the colossal ship through the water at a staggering speed of over 30 knots. This combination of speed and firepower made the Bismarck a fast, deadly predator. A Turocommerce raider designed to hunt down and destroy the merchant convoys that were Britain's lifeline. Its design philosophy was clear. Outrun anything it couldn't outgun, and outgun anything it couldn't outrun. Protection was just as important as firepower. The Bismarck was encased in a thick belt of state-of-the-art Krupp-cemented armor. This armor belt, over a foot thick in critical areas, was designed to withstand direct hits from the largest naval guns in existence. The decks were also heavily armored to protect against plunging shells and aerial bombs. The designers implemented a sophisticated system of watertight compartments, aiming to ensure the ship could absorb tremendous punishment and keep fighting. It was, by all accounts, one of the most resilient and well-protected warships ever built. Finally, on August 24, 1940, the Bismarck was officially commissioned into the Kriegsmarine. Under the command of Kapitan zur See, Ernest Lindemann, Heat's crew of over 2,200 officers and sailors began the arduous process of sea trials and training in the Baltic Sea. They had to learn to master this complex war machine, to work together as a seamless unit. From the gun crews and the turrets to the engineers deep within the ship's bowels, every system was tested, every gun fired, every maneuver practiced to perfection. The ship and its crew were being honed into a single, lethal weapon. To the German people and the leadership of the Third Reich, the Bismarck was more than just steel and guns. It was a tangible manifestation of their power and technological prowess. It was the pride of the Kriegsmarine, a symbol of their resurgence on the world stage. Propaganda hailed it as unsinkable, a modern marvel that would sweep the seas clear of its enemies. This ship embodied Hitler's naval ambitions, a direct and audacious challenge to the long-held dominance of the Royal Navy. The Bismarck wasn't just built to fight, it was built to intimidate, to strike fear into the hearts of its adversaries before a single shot was even fired. As it completed its trials and prepared for its first combat mission, the world held its breath. A Titan had been unleashed, and the storm of war was about to break across the cold, grey waters of the North Atlantic. The legend of the Bismarck was about to begin. In the spring of 1941, the port of Gotenhofen buzzed with an electric energy. Moored at the pier was a vision of steel and power, a floating fortress that embodied the very essence of Germany's military ambition. This was the Bismarck, and it was about to receive its most infamous admirer. On May 5, Adolf Hitler, accompanied by a retinue of high-ranking officials, including Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, stepped aboard the newly commissioned battleship. This wasn't just a routine inspection. It was a pilgrimage. For Hitler, the Bismarck was more than a ship. It was a symbol, a testament to the industrial might and engineering genius of his Reich. As he walked the polished steel decks, his excitement was palpable. He ran his hands along the colossal gun barrels, peered into the state-of-the-art command bridge, and spoke with the crew, his words filled with a sense of destiny. He declared the Bismarck a masterpiece, a perfect fusion of speed, armor, and firepower. To him, and to the propaganda machine that amplified his voice, the ship was the pinnacle of German technology, a weapon so advanced it was considered virtually unsinkable. This visit was carefully orchestrated, designed to project an image of overwhelming strength. Newsreels and photographs from that day would be disseminated across Germany and the world, showcasing Hitler alongside this Leviathan of the sea. The message was clear. The German war machine was unstoppable, and the Bismarck was its crown jewel. Hitler's personal endorsement cemented the ship's legendary status before it had even fired a shot in anger. He saw in its clean, powerful lines the manifestation of his own vision for Germany dominant, resilient, and superior. This belief wasn't just for public consumption. It was a conviction he held deeply. Grand Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine, had long advocated for a powerful surface fleet to challenge British naval supremacy. For years, he had pushed for the ambitious Plan Z, a massive naval construction program designed to build a fleet capable of taking on the Royal Navy head-on. The Bismarck and its sister ship, the Tirpitz, were the first fruits of this grand strategy. They were the centerpieces of a new German navy, designed not just for coastal defense, but for global power projection. During the tour, Raeder laid out his strategic vision for Hitler. He explained how the Bismarck would be used not in a direct fleet-and-fleet confrontation. Germany still lacked the numbers for that, but as a commerce raider. The plan, codenamed Operation Rheinübung, was audacious. The Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugene, would break out into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. There, they would hunt the vital convoys that were Britain's lifeline, strangling the island nation by cutting off its supply of food, fuel, and war materials. Hitler was captivated by the plan's boldness. The idea of this single, mighty ship sowing chaos and terror across the Atlantic appealed to his love for grand dramatic gestures. He saw the potential for a massive psychological blow against the British. If the Bismarck could roam the Atlantic unchecked, sinking ship after ship, it would not only cause material damage, but also crush British morale. It would demonstrate that not even the legendary Royal Navy could protect its own trade routes. The economic and strategic implications were enormous. Britain, an island nation entirely dependent on maritime imports, would be brought to its knees. For Hitler, who was already planning his invasion of the Soviet Union, securing the western flank was crucial. A successful commerce raiding campaign by the Bismarck could distract and weaken Britain, preventing it from interfering with his continental ambitions. He gave the operation his full blessing, convinced that the Bismarck's superior technology and firepower would guarantee its success. The myth of the Bismarck's invincibility was carefully cultivated. It was armed with 8 massive 15-inch guns, capable of hurling armor-piercing shells over 20 miles. Its armor belt, over a foot thick in critical areas, was designed to withstand the heaviest shells from enemy battleships. Its advanced radar and fire control systems were considered the best in the world, giving it a significant advantage in accuracy. Furthermore, it was fast, capable of speeds over 30 knots, allowing it to outrun many of its potential adversaries. To the German public and much of the military leadership, these statistics weren't just numbers. They were proof of an unassailable superiority. The ship was seen as a perfect weapon, a creation without flaws. Any suggestion that it might be vulnerable was dismissed as defeatism or a lack of faith in German engineering. This absolute belief in the ship's invincibility was a powerful propaganda tool, but it also fostered a dangerous sense of overconfidence. This wasn't the first time a nation had placed its faith in a so-called unsinkable ship. The story of the Titanic, 2 decades earlier, was a stark reminder of the folly of hubris. But in the feverish atmosphere of 1941, such lessons were forgotten. The Bismarck was a warship, not a passenger liner. It was built for battle, and its creators believed they had accounted for every possible threat. Hitler's personal tours and enthusiastic approval sealed this perception. He was not a naval expert, but his belief in will and technological supremacy was absolute. He projected his own confidence onto the ship, and in doing so, elevated it from a mere weapon of war to a national icon. The crew, under the command of the highly respected Captain Ernst Lindemann, felt the weight of this expectation. They were the custodians of Germany's pride, the men chosen to wield its greatest weapon. They were confident, highly trained, and ready to prove their ship's worth. The strategic context of Operation Rheinübung was precarious. By the spring of 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic was at a critical juncture. German U-boats were taking a heavy toll on Allied shipping, but Britain was adapting, improving its convoy system and anti-submarine tactics. Rudder believed that the introduction of powerful surface raiders like the Bismarck would tip the balance decisively in Germany's favor. U-boats could be a persistent nuisance, but a battleship could wipe out an entire convoy in a matter of hours. However, the risks were immense. The Royal Navy, though stretched thin across the globe, still controlled the key entry and exit points to the Atlantic. The waters between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK were heavily patrolled. Breaking out into the open ocean would be the Bismarck's first and greatest challenge. During his meeting with Hitler aboard the ship, Admiral Rudder presented the mission as a calculated risk, but one with a potentially enormous reward. Another key figure present was Admiral Gunther Lütjens, the fleet commander who would lead the mission from the Bismarck's bridge. Lütjens was a seasoned and cautious officer, perhaps more aware of the dangers than the political leadership. He had previously led a successful raiding mission with the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but he knew the Bismarck would be a target of unparalleled importance. The entire Royal Navy would be mobilized to hunt it down. He reportedly expressed some reservations, suggesting it might be better to wait until the Bismarck's sister ship, the Tirpitz, was also ready for action. A 2-battleship squadron would present a much greater threat and be harder to counter. However, the pressure to act was immense. Hitler was eager for a decisive victory at sea to complement his victories on land. The decision was made. The Bismarck would sail alone, with only the Prinz Eugene for company. As Hitler departed from Gotenhofen, he left behind a crew filled with a sense of historic purpose and a leadership convinced of their imminent success. His visit had transformed the Bismarck from a naval asset into a personal project, a direct extension of his own ambition. He saw the ship's impending voyage not just as a naval operation, but as a dramatic chapter in the story of his Reich. This deep personal and emotional investment is crucial to understanding what came next. The belief in the Bismarck's invincibility, a belief that Hitler himself had championed, set the stage for a national trauma. The shock and disbelief that would ripple through the German high command and the public when news of the ship's fate arrived would be all the more profound because of the myth they had so carefully constructed. The masterpiece of German engineering was sailing towards its destiny, and the whole world was watching. May 18th, 1941. In the dead of night, Two steel behemoths slipped their moorings. In Gotenafan, present-day Gdynia, Poland, the battleship Bismarck, the pride of the German Kriegsmarine, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugenie began their journey into legend. Their mission, codenamed Operation Rhine Exercise, was audacious and potentially game-changing. Their goal, to break out into the vast expanse of the North Atlantic and wreak havoc on the vital Allied convoys that were Britain's lifeline. This wasn't just about sinking ships, it was a mission aimed at crushing morale. Germany's surface fleet was hopelessly outnumbered by Britain's Royal Navy, but a successful raid by their most powerful warship could sow terror, forcing Britain to scatter its naval forces, leaving convoys vulnerable and straining the entire system to its breaking point. The strategic stakes were immense. The man in command was Admiral Gunther Lütjens, a seasoned and respected officer. He had previously led a successful Atlantic raid with the battleships Scharnhorst and Isona, so he knew the playbook, but this time he commanded a vessel that was, on paper, superior to any single ship the British could field. The Bismarck was a marvel of engineering, fast, heavily armed, and protected by incredibly thick armor. Its 8 15-inch guns could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton over 20 miles. It was, for all intents and purposes, a sea monster. Their initial route was a calculated risk. They sailed north through the Kattegat, the strait between Denmark and Sweden. This was a busy shipping lane, and being seen was almost inevitable. And seen they were. On May 20th, the Swedish cruiser Gotland spotted the German flotilla and dutifully reported their position. The secret was out. The British Admiralty in London was alerted. The great hunt was about to begin. Lütjens, aware he'd been spotted, pushed on. The ships refueled in a secluded fjord near Bergen, Norway. Here, they were spotted again, this time by a British reconnaissance Spitfire pilot. The photos he took confirmed London's worst fears. Bismarck was on the move. The Royal Navy's home fleet, under the command of Admiral Sir John Tovey, immediately scrambled its forces. The battleships King George V, Prince of Wales, and the battlecruiser Hood, along with a screen of cruisers and destroyers, set sail to intercept. Lütjens now had to make a critical decision. Which route would he take into the Atlantic? The wider passage between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, or the narrower, more treacherous Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland? The Denmark Strait was choked with ice and notorious for foul weather, but it offered the best chance of slipping past the British patrols. Lütjens chose the Denmark Strait. On the evening of May 23rd, as Bismarck and Prinz Eugene entered the strait, the weather was just as awful as Lütjens had hoped. Thick fog and rain squalls reduced visibility to a few miles. It seemed like the perfect cover, but the British had an ace up their sleeve. Their cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk, were equipped with new, advanced radar. As dusk fell, a blip appeared on the Suffolk's radar screen. It was Bismarck, just 7 miles away. The alarm bells rang. Suffolk quickly ducked into a fog bank to avoid being seen, while frantically radioing the Bismarck's position to Admiral Tovey's main force, which was still hundreds of miles away. Admiral Lütjens was furious. He knew his flagship's massive guns outranged the British cruisers, but the terrible visibility made it impossible to return fire accurately. He ordered a sharp turn and fired a salvo. The shells landed close, showering the Norfolk with massive splashes of water and knocking out its own radar. But the cruisers were nimble. They shadowed the German ships from a safe distance, using their radar to track every move, constantly reporting back. For Lütjens, the element of surprise was completely gone. His mission to be a silent, unseen predator was now impossible. He was a hunted animal, and the hunters were closing in. He reported back to German Naval Command. "I'm shadowed by 2 heavy cruisers. Intend to break through Denmark Strait." All through the cold, tense night, the cat-and-mouse game continued. The British cruisers clung to the German giants like shadows. Aboard the Bismarck, the crew was on high alert, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. They knew that at any moment, the full might of the Royal Navy could appear over the horizon. Then, just before 6 a.m. on May 24th, the lookouts on Bismarck spotted them, 2 massive shapes emerging from the gloom. It was the battlecruiser HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy for over 20 years, and the brand new, but not yet fully operational, battleship HMS Prince of Wales. The stage was set for one of the most famous and dramatic naval battles in history. The Battle of the Denmark Strait was about to begin. The clash of these titans would send shockwaves across the world and seal the fate of many brave sailors on both sides. The chase was over. The fight was on. In the shadowy corridors of the British Admiralty in London, a series of urgent, coded messages crackled to life. It was late May 1941. And the chilling news they carried would set in motion one of the greatest naval pursuits in history. The German battleship Bismarck, the most powerful warship afloat, had broken out into the North Atlantic. For the British, this was more than a threat. It was a dagger aimed at the very heart of their war effort. The Atlantic was Britain's lifeline, the vital artery through which convoys of food, fuel, and weapons flowed from North America. If Bismarck were allowed to roam free, it could sever that lifeline, starving the island nation into submission. The stakes were impossibly high. Deep within his underground war rooms, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received the news. Known for his decisive and often ruthless nature in wartime, his reaction was immediate and absolute. The order was simple, yet it carried the immense weight of an empire fighting for its survival. Sink the Bismarck. Every other naval priority was to be cast aside. This single ship had to be found and destroyed, whatever the cost. The message echoed from the highest levels of government down to every captain and sailor in the Royal Navy. It was a personnel duel now, a matter of national honor and strategic necessity. The command rippled across the vast expanse of the North Atlantic, reaching every ship flying the white ensign. The Admiralty's directive was unprecedented in its scope. Any available ship, regardless of its current mission or location, was to converge on the Bismarck's suspected position. From the icy waters north of Iceland to the balmy shipping lanes off the coast of France, the call went out. The home fleet, based at Scapa in Scotland, was the first to surge into action. Admiral John Tovey, aboard his flagship King George V, led a powerful squadron, including the brand-new aircraft carrier Victorious and the legendary battlecruiser Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy. They steamed out into the treacherous Denmark Strait, the most likely route for Bismarck's breakout. But the net being cast was far wider. From Gibraltar, the powerful Force H, commanded by Admiral James Somerville, was ordered north. This formidable group included the battlecruiser Renown and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, whose Swordfish torpedo bombers would soon play a legendary role in this epic chase. Battleships like Rodney and Ramillies, which were on escort duty for vital convoys, were detached and ordered to join the hunt. Even ships limping home for repairs were turned around and sent back into the fray. The Atlantic became a vast, strategic chessboard, with dozens of British cruisers, destroyers, and capital ships moving like hounds closing in on their quarry. The initial detection was a masterpiece of naval intelligence and reconnaissance. British spies in neutral Sweden had first spotted the German behemoth passing through their waters. This crucial piece of intelligence was confirmed by a daring reconnaissance flight by a Spitfire pilot from Rafwick in Scotland. Flying at the very edge of his range and at extreme altitude, he photographed Bismarck and its escort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugene, hiding in a fjord near Bergen, Norway. The photos were rushed to London, providing the Admiralty with the concrete evidence they needed. Bismarck was out. The hunt was on. This mobilization was a testament to the Royal Navy's global reach and its institutional muscle. For centuries, it had been the shield of the British Empire, a force designed to project power across the world's oceans. Now, it was being tested as never before. The task was monumental. The North Atlantic is a vast, unforgiving wilderness of storms, fog, and colossal waves. Finding a single ship, even one as large as Bismarck, was like searching for a needle in a continent-sized haystack, where there was a constant enemy, grounding reconnaissance aircraft and making life for the sailors on the smaller destroyers a living hell as they were tossed about by the relentless sea. Every man in the fleet, from Admiral Tovey on his flag, bridge to the youngest stoker deep in the bowels of a destroyer, understood the gravity of their mission. The name Bismarck was spoken in hushed, determined tones. It represented the pinnacle of German engineering and a direct challenge to Britain's naval supremacy. The battlecruiser Hood, in particular, was seen as the symbolic answer to Bismarck. For 20 years, She had been the largest, fastest warship in the world, the embodiment of British sea power. Her crew felt a special responsibility to engage and defeat this new German monster. The coming confrontation felt preordained, a clash of titans that would decide the fate of the Atlantic. The Admiralty, meanwhile, was a hive of frantic activity. Plotting tables were covered with charts, as intelligence officers tried to predict Bismarck's next move. Would it swing west to attack convoys heading for Canada, or would it make a wide sweep south, aiming for the trade routes from Africa and South America? Every scrap of information, every potential sighting, was analyzed with painstaking care. Radio intercepts were listened to with agonizing intensity, hoping for a single German transmission that might give away their position. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, played out over thousands of square miles of ocean, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. The initial stages of the chase were filled with frustration. After leaving the Norwegian fjord, Bismarck and Prinz Eugene vanished into the mists of the Arctic. For agonizing hours, there was silence. The British search patrols flew sortie after sortie, their pilots straining their eyes against the endless gray expanse of sea and sky. Then, a breakthrough. 2 British heavy cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk, patrolling the fog-shrouded Denmark Strait, made radar contact. It was a revolutionary moment. This was one of the first major naval actions where radar played a decisive role, allowing the British ships to shadow the German squadron from a safe distance hidden in the mist and murk, all the while reporting their position back to Tovey's approaching fleet. The trap was slowly closing. The cruisers shadowed relentlessly, dodging salvos from Bismarck's massive 15-inch guns whenever they strayed too close. Their reports were the lifeline of the entire operation, the electronic eyes of the fleet. Aboard the King George V and the Hood, the news was received with grim satisfaction. They altered course to intercept. The tension was palpable. Every sailor knew they were steaming towards a confrontation that would be violent, brutal, and decisive. The first major clash was now only hours away. The eyes of the Empire had found their target, and the full might of the Royal Navy was converging for the kill. The stage was set for a battle that would go down in the annals of naval warfare, a desperate and dramatic chase that captivated the world. The icy waters of the Denmark Strait, a narrow choke point between Greenland and Iceland, were about to become the stage for one of the most dramatic naval encounters of World War II. It's May 24th, 1941. The German behemoth, Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, is on a mission, Operation Rheinübung. Their goal? To break out into the vast expanse of the Atlantic and wreak havoc on the vital British convoy routes that were the lifeline of the island nation. But the Royal Navy was not about to let them pass unchallenged. They knew Bismarck was out there, a predator in the dark, and they were hunting it with everything they had. Leading the charge for the British was Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag from the legendary battlecruiser HMS Hood. For 20 years, the Hood had been the pride of the Royal Navy, the largest and most powerful warship in the world. She was a symbol of British sea power, a celebrity ship known and loved by the public. Accompanying her was the brand new battleship, HMS Prince of Wales. So new, in fact, that she had civilian contractors still on board, frantically working to fix teething problems with her main gun turrets. This was her shakedown cruise, a fiery baptism if there ever was one. This British force, codenamed 4C, was on an intercept course. The trap was about to be sprung. As dawn broke, the seas were rough, the sky a grim, overcast gray. Lookouts on both sides strained their eyes against the biting wind and sea spray. Then, at 5:35 a.m., a lookout on Prinz Eugene shouted the alarm. Mastheads, port side. The British had been spotted almost simultaneously. The British ships sighted the Germans. Admiral Holland had a crucial decision to make. His flagship, Hood, was a magnificent ship, but she had a critical vulnerability. Her deck armor was notoriously thin, a relic of her World War I design, making her dangerously susceptible to plunging shells fired from long range. To minimize this risk, Holland needed to close the distance as quickly as possible to get into a range where enemy shells would hit the thicker side armor instead of the weak deck. He ordered a turn towards the German ships, a head-on approach. This maneuver, however, came at a great cost. By charging straight in, he could only use his forward guns. The rear turrets of both Hood and Prince of Wales couldn't bear on the enemy. In contrast, the German ships, running on a roughly parallel course, could bring all their main guns to bear a full broadside. The Germans had the tactical advantage right from the start. At 5:52 a.m., the tranquility of the Arctic morning was shattered. Admiral Holland gave the order. Open fire. The massive 15-inch guns of HMS Hood roared to life, sending 1,000-pound shells screaming across the 7 miles of water toward the German squadron. A moment later, Prince of Wales joined the chorus. But in the poor light and confusion of the initial contact, the British gunners made a critical error. They initially targeted Prinz Eugene, mistaking her for the lead ship. The German commander, Admiral, was initially hesitant to return fire. His orders were to avoid engaging enemy warships if possible, and to focus on sinking merchant shipping. But the German gunnery officer on Bismarck, Adolf Hitler, was urgently requesting permission to fire back. With shells splashing ominously close, Lütjens finally relented. Permission to fire is granted. At 5:55 a.m., the German response came. Bismarck's 15-inch guns, renowned for their accuracy, fired their first salvo. Prinz Eugene's 8-inch guns followed suit. Their target was clear: the lead British ship, the mighty Hood. The German gunnery was terrifyingly accurate from the very beginning. The first salvo from Prinz Eugene landed a direct hit on Hood, starting a large fire amidships amidst the ready-use ammunition for her anti-aircraft guns and rocket launchers. The fire spread rapidly, creating a massive plume of black smoke that made Hood an even clearer target against the gray sky. Despite the flames, Hood pressed on, her own guns continuing their thunderous, but so far ineffective, barrage. Aboard the Prince of Wales, things weren't going much better. Her brand new guns were suffering from mechanical failures. One by one, her guns malfunctioned, dramatically reducing her rate of fire. The civilian technicians, in the midst of a full-blown naval battle, were desperately trying to get them working again. The British were now in serious trouble. One ship was on fire, the other was fighting with only a fraction of its intended firepower, and they were still pointed head-on, unable to use their rear guns. At 5:56 a.m., Admiral Holland realized his initial approach was a death trap. He ordered a turn to port, an attempt to bring the rear turrets of Hood and Prince of Wales into the action and present a parallel course to the Germans. It was the correct move, but it came too late. As Hood began her turn, Bismarck was firing its fifth salvo. The German gunners had found their range perfectly. High explosive shells, each weighing over a ton, arced through the sky on a ballistic trajectory, plunging down towards their target. The time is 6:01 a.m., just 8 minutes after the first shot was fired. A shell from that fifth salvo from Bismarck struck HMS Hood. Eyewitnesses on both sides described what happened next with a sense of awe and horror. The shell plunged deep into the heart of the ship, likely piercing the thin deck armor near the main. It penetrated down through multiple decks until it reached the aft magazines, where hundreds of tons of cordite propellant for the 15-inch guns were stored. The result was instantaneous and cataclysmic. A titanic pillar of flame erupted from the center of the Hood, soaring over 1,000 feet into the air. The ship was lifted out of the water, her back broken. A deafening roar, heard miles away, echoed across the strait as the battlecruiser was torn in half by the massive internal explosion. The bow and stern rose vertically into the air before sinking back beneath the waves. Within 3 minutes, the pride of the Royal Navy, the ship that had symbolized British maritime dominance for 2 decades, was gone. She vanished completely, leaving only a pall of smoke hanging over a patch of debris-strewn water. The shock was profound. On the bridge of Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach and his crew watched in stunned disbelief as the magnificent ship ahead of them simply disintegrated. The sheer violence of the explosion was incomprehensible. Of the 1,418 men aboard HMS Hood, only 3 survived. Ted Briggs, Bob Tilburn, and Bill Dundas were thrown into the freezing water and were miraculously rescued by the destroyer HMS Electra. Hours later, they were the sole witnesses to the final, horrifying moments from inside the ship. Their survival was a fluke, a one-in-a-million chance in a sea of death. Now, Prince of Wales was alone, facing two powerful and undamaged German warships. She was still struggling with her malfunctioning guns, and now she was the sole focus of the combined firepower of Bismarck and Prinz Eugene. Shells rained down on her. A 15-inch shell from Bismarck smashed into her bridge, killing or wounding almost everyone there, except for Captain Leach and one other man. Despite the carnage and the damage, Prince of Wales fought on bravely. She managed to land 3 hits on the Bismarck, one of which would prove to be critically important. One shell pierced Bismarck's forward fuel tanks, causing a significant fuel leak and contaminating the remaining fuel with seawater. This hit, seemingly minor at the time, would ultimately seal Bismarck's fate by forcing her to abort her Atlantic raid and head for port in occupied France. But Prince of Wales couldn't sustain the fight. Heavily damaged, with 7 direct hits from both German ships and with her main armament failing, Captain Leach made the only sensible decision. Under the cover of a smokescreen, he turned his battered ship away, breaking off the engagement and retreating. The Battle of the Denmark Strait was over. It had been a stunningly swift and brutal victory for the German squadron. In less than 10 minutes of combat, they had destroyed the most famous warship in the world and forced a brand new battleship to retreat. The news of Hood's sinking sent shockwaves through the British Admiralty and stunned the British public. The loss was a devastating blow to morale, but it also ignited a furious desire for vengeance. From Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself came the stark, uncompromising order that echoed throughout the entire Royal Navy: sink the Bismarck. The greatest naval chase in history was about to begin. The hunters had become the hunted, and the entire British home fleet was now converging on Bismarck's position with a singular, ruthless purpose. The story was far from over. May 24th, 1941. The news reached London like a physical blow. HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the symbol of British sea power for over 2 decades, was gone, vanished in a catastrophic explosion during its first engagement with the German battleship Bismarck. Out of a crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived. The shockwave of this loss radiated from the Admiralty through the halls of Parliament and into every home in Great Britain. It was a national trauma, a devastating humiliation. In the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was incandescent with fury. For him, this was not just a tactical loss. It was a personal affront. Hood was more than a ship. She was an icon. Her destruction at the hands of Hitler's new super battleship was a stark and terrifying message. Churchill, gripping a cigar, his voice thick with emotion and resolve, issued a directive that would echo through naval history. Each was simply brutal and absolute. Sink the Bismarck. That order was more than a command. It was a vow of vengeance. It electrified the entire British establishment. The hunt was on. The largest naval pursuit in the annals of the Royal Navy began to mobilize with breathtaking speed. Every available ship, from battleships and aircraft carriers to cruisers and destroyers, was diverted to a single all-consuming task. From Gibraltar, Force H, commanded by the formidable Admiral Sir James Somerville, was ordered to sea. This powerful squadron, including the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battlecruiser HMS Renown, steamed north at flank speed, a dagger aimed at Bismarck's southern escape route. From Scapa Flow, the home fleet, under the command of Admiral Sir John Tovey, was already in pursuit. Tovey, aboard his flagship HMS King George V, was a man possessed. He had lost Hood under his watch, and he was determined to see her avenged. With him were the battleship Rodney, the aircraft carrier Victorious, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers, a steel fist ready to smash the German raider. The Atlantic became a vast, 3-dimensional chessboard. The British had to predict Bismarck's next move. Would Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lutjens make a dash for the safety of a French port like Brest or Sink, or would they turn back north, hoping to slip through the Denmark Strait again and disappear into the Arctic? Or, most dangerously, would they break out into the open Atlantic to wreak havoc on the vital convoys that were Britain's lifeline? The stakes were astronomically high. If Bismarck escaped, it would be a strategic disaster. It could roam the Atlantic almost unopposed, severing the supply lines from North America. Britain, already standing alone against the Axis, could be starved into submission. The Battle of the Atlantic, and perhaps the entire war, hung in the balance. Aboard the Bismarck, Admiral Lütjens was weighing his own options. He had won a stunning victory, but his ship was not unscathed. One of the shells from HMS Prince of Wales had struck a forward fuel tank, causing a significant oil leak and contaminating a large portion of his fuel supply. Bismarck was bleeding a telltale oil slick across the ocean, a trail for his hunters to follow. More importantly, the damage reduced his maximum range. A breakout into the open Atlantic was now a much riskier proposition. He made a fateful decision. He would detach his heavy cruiser, Prinz Eugene, to continue commerce raiding on its own, while Bismarck, with its reduced speed and fuel, would make for the French coast for repairs. Back on the British side, the initial stages of the hunt were fraught with frustration. The cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, which had so brilliantly shadowed Bismarck through the Denmark Strait, were struggling to maintain contact. In the swirling mists and rain squalls of the North Atlantic, the German battleship was a phantom. Several times, the cruisers lost radar contact, sending waves of anxiety through the British fleet. Admiral Tovey, desperate to slow the German giant, made a bold move. He detached his brand-new aircraft carrier, HMS Victorious, to launch a strike. The conditions were atrocious. The carrier was pitching and rolling violently in heavy seas. The pilots, flying obsolete ferry Swordfish, biplanes affectionately known as string bags, were facing a near-suicidal mission. These fabric-covered planes were slow and vulnerable, armed with a single torpedo each. As dusk fell, 9 Swordfish took off from Victorious's bucking flight deck and flew into the gloom. They located Bismarck through their primitive radar, diving through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that lit up the night sky. It was a chaotic, terrifying attack. The German gunners threw up a wall of flak, but the slow speed of the Swordfish actually worked to their advantage, throwing off the sophisticated fire control of the German gunners. Against all odds, one torpedo found its mark. It struck Bismarck's armored belt, causing a minor shock, but no significant damage. 1 man was killed, the first casualty on the Bismarck. While the strike was not the decisive blow the British had hoped for, it was a psychological victory. It proved that even in the vastness of the Atlantic, Bismarck was not safe from air attack. However, shortly after the Swordfish attack, disaster struck for the British. In the early hours of May 25th, Bismarck, under the cover of darkness and a sharp, skillfully executed turn, gave its pursuers the slip. Suffolk and Norfolk lost contact. For the British Admiralty, the news was a nightmare. The most powerful battleship in the world was loose in the Atlantic, and they had no idea where it was. The next 31 hours were some of the most tense and desperate of the entire war for the Royal Navy. The search area was immense. Where had Bismarck gone? Every possible course was plotted, every contingency considered. A chilling silence fell over the plotting tables in London. Radio rooms across the fleet listened intently for any clue, any scrap of an intercepted signal. The hunter had become the hunted, but now the prey had vanished. The British threw every asset they had into the search. Coastal Command patrol aircraft from Iceland and Northern Ireland were sent on sprawling, long-range sorties, their crews scanning the endless gray waves for any sign of the German ship. The weight of the world seemed to rest on the shoulders of the pilots and observers in those cold, rattling aircraft. Meanwhile, aboard the ships of the home fleet, frustration mounted. They were burning precious fuel, steaming in what might be the wrong direction. Admiral Tovey aboard King George V was facing the grim possibility that Bismarck might just escape entirely. The public in Britain held its breath. The initial shock of Hood's sinking had given way to a burning desire for retribution. But now, that desire was mixed with a gnawing anxiety. But then, the Germans made a critical mistake, believing he was still being shadowed. Admiral, a man known for his strict adherence to procedure, broke radio silence. He transmitted a long signal back to Germany, reporting on the sinking of the Hood and his intention to head for France. The message was over 30 minutes long. It was an astonishing error in judgment. British listening stations immediately picked up the transmission. Direction-finding equipment on multiple ships and shore stations sprang into action, taking bearings on the signal. The initial plots were confusing, and a plotting error at the Admiralty initially sent the hunting pack steaming in the wrong direction, towards the north. It was a moment of supreme agony. For several crucial hours, the British fleet was actually increasing its distance from Bismarck, but the mistake was soon rectified. A naval intelligence officer, re-examining the data, realized the error and a new, corrected position was established. The hunt was back on, with renewed ferocity. The new plot showed that Bismarck was indeed making a run for France. But time was running out. Bismarck was getting dangerously close to the point where it would be under the protection of land-based German bombers. If it reached that air cover, the Royal Navy's surface ships and carriers would be incredibly vulnerable. The British had one last chance. It all came down to Admiral Somerville's Force H, steaming up from Gibraltar. Specifically, it came down to the aircraft carrier HMS Royal and her squadron of Swordfish torpedo bombers. They were the only force close enough and fast enough to intercept Bismarck and slow it down before it could reach the safety of the French coast. As the morning of May 26th dawned, the weather was worsening. A gale was blowing, whipping the Atlantic into a frenzy. A Catalina flying boat from Coastal Command, on the very edge of its endurance, finally found it. The pilot, American Ensign Leonard Tuck Smith, on loan to the RA, broke the agonizing silence with a simple, electrifying message: have sighted a battleship, bearing 240 degrees, distance 5 miles. The prey was found. The final, desperate phase of the hunt was about to begin. The fate of the Bismarck and the honor of the Royal Navy now rested on the wings of a handful of obsolete biplanes, flying into the teeth of a storm. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic and pivotal confrontations in modern naval history. In our last episode, we witnessed the stunning, brutal clash in the Denmark Strait, where Bismarck and Prince Eugene sank the mighty HMS Hood and damaged the Prince of Wales. It was a shocking victory for the Kriegsmarine, but it came at a high price. Now, the story takes a dramatic turn. This is the tale of Bismarck alone, a wounded giant hunted by the most powerful navy in the world. After the battle, Admiral Lutyens faced a critical decision. Bismarck had taken hits. One shell from the Prince of Wales had pierced a forward fuel tank, causing a significant fuel leak and contaminating what remained. Another hit had flooded a generator room and severed a steam pipe, reducing her top speed. She was bleeding, leaving a glistening, telltale oil slick on the surface of the cold North Atlantic. The plan to wreak havoc on Allied shipping convoys was now in serious jeopardy. Lutyens knew he couldn't continue the mission in this state. The damage needed to be repaired, and the ship needed to refuel. He made a fateful choice. He would detach his undamaged companion, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugene, to carry on the commerce-raiding mission alone. Bismarck, the pride of the fleet, would turn for the relative safety of a friendly port in occupied France, Saint-Nazaire, the only port on the Atlantic coast, with a dry dock big enough to hold her. On the evening of May 24th, under the cover of a rain squall and fading light, the two German warships executed a masterful maneuver. Bismarck suddenly turned hard to starboard, directly towards her pursuers, the British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk, who had been shadowing them relentlessly with their radar. The move was so unexpected that the British ships were forced to break away to avoid a direct confrontation. In that brief, chaotic moment of confusion, Prince Eugene slipped away undetected, disappearing into the vastness of the ocean to begin her own solitary journey. The plan had worked, but now Bismarck was truly on her own. The Royal Navy, however, was far from defeated. They were enraged. The loss of the Hood, a symbol of British naval pride, was a national humiliation that demanded vengeance. From every corner of the North Atlantic, the order went out: sink the Bismarck. An unprecedented naval concentration was now converging on the German battleship's position. The home fleet, led by Admiral Tovey aboard the battleship King George V, was steaming hard from Scapa Flow. Force H, commanded by Admiral Somerville, was racing up from Gibraltar. Its powerful assets, including the aircraft carrier HMS Royal and the battlecruiser Renown, dozens of cruisers, destroyers, and even submarines were all being vectored in for the kill. The greatest naval pursuit in history was underway. Aboard Bismarck, the mood was tense. The crew worked tirelessly to manage the damage. Divers were sent over the side in the freezing Atlantic waters to try and patch the leaking fuel tank from the outside. A near impossible and heroic effort. They managed to slow the leak, but couldn't stop it entirely. The oil slick remained, a breadcrumb trail for her hunters. Ludgens and his officers knew that every hour brought the enemy closer. Their only hope was to outrun them, to reach the protective umbrella of the Luftwaffe's air cover off the French coast. For a time, it seemed they might just make it. The British cruisers Suffolk and Norfolk continued their dogged pursuit, using their radar to keep tabs on the German behemoth from a safe distance. But then, on the night of May 24th, something incredible happened. Admiral, perhaps overconfident in the superiority of German radar or underestimating the British, made a critical error. He broke radio silence, sending a long, 30-minute message back to Germany, reporting on the engagement and his intentions. British listening posts immediately picked up the transmission and took a bearing. They had a fix. But then, a strange twist of fate. The British direction-finding equipment on Admiral Tovey's flagship was faulty. The plotters misinterpreted the signal's origin and incorrectly calculated Bismarck's position. They concluded she was breaking back towards the Iceland-Faroes Gap to return to Germany. Based on this flawed intelligence, Tovey ordered his fleet to alter course to intercept, sending them steaming in the wrong direction for several crucial hours. Bismarck, still heading for France, had inadvertently given her pursuers the slip. On the morning of May 25th, the unbelievable happened. The British cruisers lost contact. One moment, Bismarck was a clear blip on Suffolk's radar screen. The next, she was gone. She had vanished into the immense gray emptiness of the Atlantic. Panic began to set in on the British bridge. Where had she gone? Had she turned back? Was she doubling back to attack the convoys after all? The most powerful battleship in the world was loose, and nobody knew where she was. For over 30 agonizing hours, the Royal Navy searched blindly. The fleet was scattered, fuel was running low, and morale was plummeting. The fear was that Bismarck would escape entirely, live to fight another day, and continue to be a deadly threat in the Atlantic. Aboard Bismarck, there was a glimmer of hope. The constant, nerve-wracking presence of the British cruisers was gone. The radar screens were clear. They were alone and undetected. The race for France was on, and for a moment it looked like they were winning. But the hunt was not over. The British Admiralty, realizing the potential for a catastrophic failure, threw every available resource into the search. They enlisted the help of RAF Coastal Command. Long-range Catalina flying boats were dispatched from bases in Northern Ireland to fly vast, sweeping search patterns over the likely routes to France. It was a search for a needle in a haystack, a single ship in millions of square miles of ocean. On the morning of May 26th, after more than a day of terrifying silence, the breakthrough came. A Catalina flying boat, piloted by an American naval aviator serving with the RF, was nearing the end of its patrol pattern and low on fuel. Suddenly, through a break in the clouds, the co-pilot spotted it. A massive warship churning a wake through the waves. They descended for a closer look, braving the ship's ferocious anti-aircraft fire. The message was flashed back to the Admiralty, electrifying the British command. Bismarck sighted. She was found. The position was grim for the Germans. They were still over 600 miles from the safety of France, but now the entire Royal Navy knew exactly where they were. Worse still, the force closest to them was Admiral Somerville's Force H, approaching from the south. Its most potent weapon was the aircraft carrier Ark Royal. Bismarck's only hope had been to outrun her pursuers. Now, her only chance was to fight off a new kind of threat, one she was not entirely prepared for. An attack from the air. As dusk began to fall on May 26th, Ark Royal launched her strike force, a squadron of obsolete but reliable ferry Swordfish torpedo bombers. These were biplanes, fabric-covered aircraft that looked like relics from a bygone era. They, very slow, vulnerable, and affectionately known as string bags by their crews. But in the hands of the brave and skilled pilots of the fleet Aram, they were deadly. This was Bismarck's final trial. Could her formidable anti-aircraft defenses fend off these seemingly antiquated attackers? Everything depended on it. The first strike was a near disaster for the British in the poor visibility and confusion. The Swordfish pilots mistook the British cruiser HMS Sheffield, which had been sent ahead to shadow Bismarck, for the German battleship. They launched their torpedoes. But luckily, Sheffield managed to evade all but one, and that one failed to detonate due to a faulty magnetic detonator. It was an embarrassing mistake, but it provided a crucial piece of information. The magnetic detonators were unreliable. For the next and final strike, the torpedoes would be fitted with simpler, more reliable contact detonators. As the sun set, Ark Royal launched her second and last-ditch attack. 15 Swordfish took to the stormy skies, flying into the teeth of a gale. What happened next would seal Bismarck's fate. In a desperate, chaotic engagement, the slow-moving biplanes pressed home their attack against a hurricane of flak. 2 torpedoes found their mark. One struck Bismarck's armored belt, causing minor flooding but no critical damage. But the other was a 1-in-a-million shot. It struck Bismarck's stern, not on the hull, but directly on her port rudder. The explosion jammed the rudder at a 12-degree angle. The ship, which had been steaming directly for France, was now trapped in an uncontrollable turn to port, heading back towards her pursuers. On the bridge, chaos reigned. The crew fought desperately to free the jammed rudders. They tried using engine power, alternating the speeds of the 3 massive propellers to try and steer the ship. It was no see. They sent divers down again in the pitch-black, churning sea. But the damage was too severe. The great battleship was unsteerable. She was, as Admiral Lutyens radioed to Germany in his final message, "Ship unmaneuverable, we will fight to the last shell." Long live the Führer. Bismarck was a lame duck, circling helplessly in the Atlantic, waiting for the executioners to arrive. The hunt was over. The final battle was about to begin. Today, we dive into one of the most dramatic and improbable moments in naval history. The final, desperate gamble to stop the most feared warship on the planet. As we rejoin the story, the situation is bleak. Bismarck has shaken off its pursuers and is steaming towards the safety of occupied France. The Royal Navy's massive battleships, King George V and Rheinübung, and their fuel is running critically low. If Bismarck reaches the protective umbrella of German air cover, the chase is over. All hope now rests on a single, aging aircraft carrier, HMS Ark Royal and its squadron of antiquated biplanes. These weren't sleek, modern fighters. They were fairy Swordfish torpedo bombers, affectionately known as string bags by their crews. With their fabric-covered wings, open cockpits, and fixed landing gear, they looked like relics from a bygone era. They were slow, vulnerable, and flying into the teeth of a ferocious Atlantic gale. The winds were gusting up to 60 miles per hour, whipping the sea into a frenzy of towering waves. The deck of the Ark Royal was pitching and rolling so violently that at times it was plunging 50 feet. Just taking off was a life-threatening ordeal. But the men of the Fleet Air Arm were a special breed. They knew the odds. They knew that flying a biplane with a top speed of just over 100 miles per hour, Inarikan, against the formidable anti-aircraft defenses of the Bismarck, was a mission bordering on suicide. Yet, not a single man hesitated. Their first attempt was a disaster. In the chaos of the storm and with limited visibility, the first wave of Swordfish pilots mistakenly targeted one of their own ships, the cruiser HMS Sheffield, which had been sent ahead to shadow the Bismarck. In a testament to the skill of the Sheffield's captain and the malfunctioning of their new magnetic torpedo detonators, all torpedoes either missed or exploded harmlessly on impact with the water. It was a frustrating and embarrassing start, but it yielded a crucial piece of information. The magnetic detonators were unreliable. For the next attack, they would have to use the older, contact-fused torpedoes, which meant they had to get even closer to their target. As dusk began to fall on May 26, 1941, the Ark Royal turned into the wind one last time. 15 Swordfish lumbered into the stormy sky for the final, do-or-die attack. They were led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, a man who would later earn the Victoria Cross for his incredible bravery in another near-suicidal mission, flying just 50 feet above the raging waves to stay below the low-hanging clouds. They navigated through rain and sea spray, their open cockpits offering no protection from the elements. Imagine being in one of those planes, the canvas wings flexing, and groaning, the engines sputtering against the wind, soaked to the bone, with the freezing Atlantic just feet below you. Finally, through a break in the storm, they saw it. The silhouette of the Bismarck, a monstrous shape on the horizon, already spitting flashes of fire into the twilight. The German gunners were ready. As the Swordfish began their attack runs, the sky erupted. A barrage of anti-aircraft fire, from massive 15-inch shells to rapid-firing 20mm cannons, filled the air around the slow-moving planes. The Germans threw up a wall of steel, creating geysers of water as their shells exploded all around the attackers. The pilots pressed on, jinking and weaving through the maelstrom. They had to fly straight and level in the final moments of their run to give their torpedoes a chance. It was in these seconds that they were most vulnerable. Several planes were riddled with shrapnel, their fabric wings torn to shreds. One pilot, Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat, later recalled seeing the glowing red tracers of the cannon shells floating past him like strings of red beads. The attacks came from all directions, confusing the Bismarck's gunnery directors. Pilots braved the fire, dropped their torpedoes, and banked away, praying they had done their job. The first few torpedoes struck the thick armored belt of the Bismarck's midsection and exploded, doing little more than shaking the giant and enraging its crew. It seemed the attack was failing. The bravery of the pilots was immense, but it looked like it wouldn't be enough. The Bismarck was simply too tough. But then, fate, or sheer dumb luck, intervened. Two Swordfish, flown by sub-lieutenants Moffat and Dixon, were forced to swing wide on their approach. This meant they attacked the Bismarck, not from the side, but from the stern. As the Bismarck was turning to port to avoid their torpedoes, one of the last torpedoes dropped and the attack ran true. It didn't hit the thick armor. Instead, it struck the weakest, most vulnerable part of the ship, its stern. The 485-pound warhead detonated right against the Bismarck's port rudder. The explosion was catastrophic. It didn't just damage the rudder. It twisted and jammed it hard to port. Simultaneously, the blast wave buckled the steering gear in the compartments inside, locking it. Immovably, on the bridge of the Bismarck, Admiral Lutjens and Captain Lindemann felt a violent shudder. The ship, which had been masterfully evading its pursuers, suddenly began to turn in a large, uncontrollable circle. The helmsman reported the wheel was useless. Damage control teams rushed to the stern, but the compartments were flooded and battered. Divers were sent to try and assess the damage, but the force of the ship's own propellers and the churning sea made it impossible to get close. They even considered using explosives to blow the jammed rudder off. But Bismarck was trapped. Its powerful engines were still fully functional, but they were now its enemy. Every turn of its mighty propellers only forced the ship to circle, heading northwest directly back towards its hunters, King George V and Rodney. The Hunter had become the Hunted. A one-in-a-million shot, delivered by an obsolete biplane in a hurricane, had sealed the fate of the world's most powerful battleship. The Swordfish, their job done, turned for home, battling their way back to the Ark Royal, leaving the crippled giant to face its final dawn. The morning of May 27, 1941, broke gray and stormy over the North Atlantic. For the crew of the German battleship Bismarck, it was the dawn of their final day. After a relentless chase that had spanned thousands of square kilometers of ocean, the hunters had finally cornered their prey. The pride of the Kriegsmarine, damaged and bleeding oil, was a wounded giant, her rudder jammed, steaming in a slow, agonizing circle. On the horizon, through the rain and the mist, the silhouettes of her executioners appeared. The Royal Navy was here, and they had come for blood. The first to arrive was the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk, which had been shadowing Bismarck for hours. Soon after, the battleships HMS King George V and HMS Rodney hove into view. This was the moment the British had been praying for. The Rodney, a veteran of the Great War, carried massive 16-inch guns, the largest in the British fleet. The King George V, a modern powerhouse, was armed with a battery of 14-inch guns. They were here to finish a job that had cost the British their beloved battle cruiser HMS Hood. For the men personified of the Royal Navy, this was not just a military operation. It was vengeance. At 8:47 a.m., the order was given. The Rodney opened fire, its colossal 16-inch shells screaming across the tempestuous sea. The King George V followed suit a minute later. The first salvos were off, bracketing the German behemoth. On board Bismarck, the crew braced for impact. They had fought gallantly, sinking the Hood and damaging the Prince of Wales. But now, trapped and outnumbered, their fate was sealed. Yet, they would not go down without a fight. Bismarck's own guns, the formidable 15-inch SKC-34s, roared back in defiance. The initial exchange was a maelstrom of fire and steel. Bismarck's gunnery was surprisingly accurate, despite her crippled state. Her shells straddled Rodney, sending towering plumes of water erupting around the British battleship. But it was a futile effort. The German ship's inability to steer made her a predictable, stationary target. The British gunners, dialing in their range, began to find their mark. Shell after shell slammed into Bismarck's superstructure. At 8:54 a.m., a 14-inch shell from King George V struck near Bismarck's forward command tower, followed by another. The forward fire control director was knocked out. Then, the heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire joined the fray, adding her 8-inch guns to the chorus of destruction. The Rodney, closing the range to a brutal, point-blank distance, was now firing full broadsides. The sheer weight of fire was overwhelming. An observer on the Rodney would later describe the scene as watching a city block being systematically demolished. Explosions ripped through Bismarck's upper decks. Fires erupted, spewing thick, black smoke that mingled with the gray morning sky. The ship was being torn apart, piece by piece. By 9:02 a.m. a 16-inch shell from Rodney had struck Bismarck's forward turrets, Anton and Bruno, silencing them forever. The main armament, the very soul of the battleship, was being neutralized. The bridge was a wreck, and Admiral Gunther Lütjens and Captain Ernst Lindemann were likely killed early in the engagement. Command devolved to the officers below, who fought on with a grim Teutonic determination. But the British were relentless. They were not just trying to sink the Bismarck. They were methodically annihilating her. The Rodney, now dangerously close, was firing its 16-inch guns on an almost flat trajectory. The shells didn't just penetrate, they punched straight through the superstructure, causing catastrophic damage. Bismarck's secondary guns continued to fire sporadically, a testament to the courage of her crew. But they were no match for the main batteries of the British battleships. One by one, Bismarck's gun emplacements were silent. The ship, once a symbol of German naval power, was being reduced to a burning, silent hulk. The scene was one of almost unimaginable violence. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burning steel. The constant, deafening roar of the guns was punctuated by the metallic shriek of incoming shells and the sickening crunch of their impact. On the British ships, sailors watched in a mixture of awe and horror as the mighty Bismarck was slowly dismantled. Her foretop was shot away, her funnel was riddled with holes, and her entire superstructure was a tangled, blazing ruin. Yet, she refused to sink. Her German-engineered compartmentalization and heavy armor belt were holding up, even under this apocalyptic punishment. Below the waterline, the hull remained largely intact. Though she was a wreck above, she was still afloat. The British battleships were running low on fuel and had fired hundreds of shells. At 10:15 a.m., with Bismarck a helpless, blazing wreck, the British battleships, their job done, turned for home. But the final act was yet to play out. The task of delivering the coup de grace fell to the heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire. Closing in on the crippled vessel, the Dorsetshire fired 2 torpedoes into Bismarck's starboard side. She then circled around and fired another into the port side. Even as this happened, the surviving German crew, determined that their ship would not be captured, were setting scuttling charges in the engine rooms. They opened the watertight doors and seacocks, ensuring a swift and final end. Bismarck began to list heavily to port. Her red-painted hull became visible as she rolled over. For a few moments, the once mighty warship lay on her side, her fires still burning. Then, at 10:39 a.m., she capsized and sank, stern first, slipping beneath the waves of the Atlantic. The battle was over. Of Timoritan, 2,200 men aboard the Bismarck. Only 115 would be rescued by the British ships before a U-boat Elan forced them to withdraw, leaving hundreds of German sailors to their fate in the cold, unforgiving ocean. The sinking of the Bismarck was a pivotal moment in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a brutal, drawn-out execution that demonstrated the Royal Navy's sea, power, and resolve. The chase and final battle became a legend, a story of pursuit, defiance, and ultimate, tragic destruction. The Bismarck, a ship that was supposed to dominate the seas, now lies in the silent darkness, 3 miles deep, a permanent monument to the ferocity of war at sea. The final hours of the battleship were a symphony of destruction, a brutal, deafening opera of steel and fire. For the German sailors aboard, it was the end of their world. As enemy shells rained down, each impact was a cataclysm. Survivors would later speak of the sheer, terrifying violence of it all, a sensory overload that defied description. One moment, they were at their stations, a well-oiled machine of war. The next, chaos erupted. The first direct hit was a thunderclap that shook the very soul of the ship. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical blow that threw men from their feet. A massive explosion ripped through the forward section, and a searing wave of heat and shrapnel tore through compartments. The lights flickered and died, plunging entire sections into a horrifying, smoke-filled darkness. Cries of pain and shock were swallowed by the continuous roar of battle. Fire became an enemy as deadly as the shells. It spread with terrifying speed, feeding on paint, oil, and ammunition. The air grew thick with acrid smoke, making every breath a struggle. Sailors, their faces blackened with soot, fought desperately to contain the blazes, their hoses often rendered useless by ruptured water mains. The heat was so intense it warped steel bulkheads, trapping men in fiery tombs. Then came the water. With the hull breached in multiple places, the sea began its relentless invasion. A cold, dark torrent flooded the lower decks, rising with alarming speed. The ship started to list a sickening, unnatural tilt that sent loose equipment and bodies sliding across the decks. The groan of twisting metal became the ship's death rattle, a constant, agonizing sound that frayed the nerves of even the most seasoned veterans. In the engine rooms, it was a special kind of hell. Engineers and stokers, the heart of the ship, worked in blistering heat amidst a maze of pipes and machinery. When a shell pierced their domain, superheated steam erupted from ruptured lines, scalding anyone in its path. Yet, many stayed at their posts, trying to keep the engines running, to give their ship a fighting chance, even as the water rose around their ankles, then their knees. Their loyalty was to their ship, to their comrades, until the very end. On the gun turrets, the crews served their massive cannons with a desperate, focused intensity. They were deafened by the constant firing, their world reduced to the violent recoil of the guns and the flash of explosions. They knew they were outmatched, outnumbered, but they refused to surrender. Each salvo was an act of defiance, a final shout into the storm. As their turrets were hit, one by one, they were silenced in thunderous blasts that sent armor plating spinning into the sea. Amidst the chaos, there were countless acts of bravery. Men pulled their injured comrades from the flames, risking their own lives to give a friend a few more moments. Officers rallied their crews, shouting orders over the din, trying to maintain some semblance of order in a world turned upside heck. They were no longer just sailors. They were brothers, bound together by the shared horror of their ship's final moments. The list grew more severe. The deck, once a flat, solid surface, was now a steep, slippery incline. The ship was dying, and everyone knew it. The order to abandon ship was finally given, a heartbreaking admission of defeat. But for many, it was too late. They were trapped below decks, in flooded compartments, or behind warped, jammed doors. For those who could make it, the journey to the main deck was a treacherous obstacle course through fire, smoke, and rising water. Reaching the open air wasn't a guarantee of safety. The sea around the ship was a churning maelstrom of oil, debris, and struggling men. Explosions continued to rock the vessel, sending showers of hot metal and shrapnel into the water. As the sailors jumped into the cold, unforgiving ocean, they left behind their home, their fortress, their tomb. From the water, they watched their magnificent ship's final, agonizing moments. It rolled over its massive hull exposed to the sky like a wounded beast. The fires still burned, casting an eerie, hellish glow. Then, with a final, deep groan, the battleship slid beneath the waves, its bow rising for one last moment of defiance before disappearing into the depths. A massive plume of steam and smoke erupted from the spot where it vanished, marking its grave. The silence that followed was as profound as the preceding noise. All that remained were the survivors, floating in the cold water, surrounded by the ghosts of their ship and their fallen comrades. They were witnesses to the end of an era, their minds forever scarred by the horror of what they had seen and endured. Their stories, fragments of a larger tragedy, are a testament to the bravery and the suffering that took place in the last stand of their crew. May 27, 1941. At the Wolf's Lair, his remote military headquarters, nestled deep in the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler received the news he had been dreading. The pride of the German Navy, the mighty battleship Bismarck, had been sunk. The report detailed a brutal, relentless final battle. British torpedo bombers had crippled its steering, leaving it to circle helplessly in the vast Atlantic. Then, the Royal Navy's battleships, King George V and Rodney, closed in, unleashing a storm of shells that silenced the Bismarck's guns one by one. The ship, a symbol of German engineering and naval ambition, was now a wreck at the bottom of the ocean, taking over 2,000 sailors with it. For Hitler, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was a personal humiliation. He had pinned immense hope and propaganda value on the Bismarck. Its maiden voyage was meant to be a demonstration of German dominance, a terror to the Allied convoys that were Britain's lifeline. The ship's very existence was a statement. Its loss was a catastrophic blow to that image. Eyewitness accounts from his inner circle describe a man consumed by fury. He paced his briefing room, his face contorted with rage, launching into a tirade that spared no one. The target of his venom was the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, and its commander, Grand Admiral Erich Rudder. In Hitler's mind, the operation was a disaster from start to finish. He saw it as a reckless gamble, a poorly planned sortie that had risked Germany's most valuable naval asset for what he now deemed a pointless raid. He accused a naval high command of incompetence, of arrogance, of failing to grasp the realities of modern warfare. He shouted that the age of the great surface battleship was over, rendered obsolete by air power, the very thing that had doomed the Bismarck. The torpedoes from a handful of ancient-looking biplanes, the ferry Swordfish, had sealed its fate. This, to Hitler, was an unforgivable failure of strategy. He completely lost faith in his surface fleet. The grandiose Zeppelin, an ambitious naval expansion program designed to challenge the Royal Navy, was now, in his eyes, a monumental waste of resources. What was the point of building these colossal, expensive ships if they could be so easily hunted and destroyed by aircraft and a numerically superior enemy? His generals and admirals listened in stunned silence as he tore apart their prestige and their plans. The trust that had existed between him and his naval command was shattered in that moment. The dream of a German high-seas fleet to rival Britain's was dead, sunk along with the Bismarck. The consequences of this outburst were immediate and far-reaching. Hitler issued a series of draconian orders. From that day forward, no major German warship was to venture into the Atlantic without his express, personal approval. This effectively chained the surface fleet to its ports in Germany and occupied Norway. Ships, like the Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, and the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, were to be used with extreme caution, primarily as a fleet and being a threat that tied down British naval resources but rarely engaged in direct combat. They were forbidden from taking the kind of risks that had led to the Bismarck's demise. The era of the daring commerce raider was over. This strategic pivot had a profound impact on the war at sea. With the surface fleet sidelined, Hitler turned his attention and Germany's industrial might almost exclusively toward the U-boat arm, commanded by Karl Dönitz. Dönitz had long argued that submarines, not battleships, were the key to strangling Britain. Now, Hitler was finally listening. Resources, steel, and skilled labor that would have gone into building new cruisers and battleships were redirected to the U-boat pens. The production of submarines was massively accelerated. The wolf packs of the Atlantic, which had already proven effective, were about to be unleashed on an unprecedented scale. The Battle of the Atlantic was entering its most brutal and decisive phase. A war of attrition fought beneath the waves. But the shift wasn't just naval. At that very moment, in late May and early June of 1941, the final preparations were underway for the largest land invasion in human history, Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union. The failure of the Bismarck reinforced Hitler's continental mindset. He had always been a land-based strategist at heart, deeply skeptical of naval power compared to the panzer divisions he understood so well. The Bismarck fiasco convinced him that Germany's destiny lay not on the high seas, but on the vast plains of the East. The resources saved from the neutered surface fleet were not just funneled into U, but also into tanks, artillery, and aircraft for the Eastern Front. The war machine was reorienting. The Kriegsmarine's role was reduced to a supporting one, protecting the Norwegian coast, menacing Allied convoys in the Arctic, but never again challenging the Royal Navy for control of the Atlantic. Grand Admiral Rudder's influence waned dramatically. He would eventually be replaced by Dönitz in 1943, a move that formalized the Navy's shift to a submarine-centric force. The surviving great ships had a grim future ahead of them. The Nysona was severely damaged in port and never repaired. The Scharnhorst was sunk in the Battle of the North Cape. And the Tirpitz, the lonely queen of the North, spent years hiding in Norwegian fjords, a constant target for British bombers, until she too was finally sunk by massive tallboy bombs. In the end, Hitler's rage on that day in May 1941 set the course for the rest of the war. His loss of faith in the surface fleet was total and irreversible, while it led to a terrifying escalation of the U-boat war. It also marked the end of Germany's ambition to be a global naval power. The ghost of the Bismarck would haunt the Kriegsmarine until the very end, a powerful symbol not just of a sunken ship, but of a sunken strategy. The fury of one man, reacting to one defeat, reshaped the entire conflict, shifting its focus from the gray waves of the Atlantic to the bloody battlefields of the Eastern Front and the silent, deadly depths where the wolf packs roamed. The story of the Bismarck doesn't end with its fiery plunge into the Atlantic depths. Its sinking on May 27, 1941, was far more than just the end of a single warship. It was a pivotal moment in the Second World War, sending ripples through naval strategy that are still felt today. The legacy of the Bismarck is a complex tapestry of triumph, tragedy, and tactical revolution. For the British Royal Navy, the sinking was a monumental victory. It was a matter of national pride and survival. The destruction of the Hood, the pride of their fleet, just days earlier had been a devastating blow to British morale. The order from Churchill himself was simple and brutal. Sink the The relentless pursuit, involving a massive contingent of the home fleet, was a demonstration of Britain's unwavering resolve. When the Bismarck finally went down, the victory was a much-needed morale boost for a nation standing almost alone against the might of the Axis powers. It unequivocally reasserted the Royal Navy's dominance in the Atlantic, proving that even the most formidable surface raider could not escape its grasp. This success secured the vital convoy routes, the lifelines that supplied Britain with food, fuel, and war materials from North America. Without these convoys, Britain would have been starved into submission. The sinking of the Bismarck ensured that the lifeline remained open. For Germany and the Kriegsmarine, the loss was a catastrophic failure. The Bismarck was the embodiment of German engineering and naval ambition. It was supposed to be a symbol of their new, powerful navy, a weapon that could single-handedly cripple British commerce and challenge the Royal Navy's supremacy. Its operational life lasted a mere 9 days. Its failure exposed deep flaws in German naval strategy. The plan for surface raiders to operate independently, far from air cover and support, proved to be a fatal gamble. The Kriegsmarine had bet big on the power and supposed invulnerability of its super battleships. But the reality was that they were vulnerable, especially to air power. The disabling of the Bismarck's rudder by a single torpedo from an antiquated Swordfish biplane was a lesson learned the hard way. It showed that naval aviation was the new king of the seas. This realization was a turning point. Hitler, already skeptical of the surface fleet, lost faith in his big ships. He became increasingly convinced that the future of the naval war lay with the U-boats. The submarine wolf. After the Bismarck, Germany's major surface warships, like the Tirpitz, were largely relegated to a flattened being role, tying up British resources by their mere existence but rarely venturing out to challenge the enemy directly. The age of the battleship as the ultimate naval weapon was coming to a swift and decisive end. The hunt for the Bismarck itself has become the stuff of legend. It remains one of the most dramatic and suspenseful sea chases in history. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out over 3 days and nearly 2,000 miles of the unforgiving North Atlantic. The story is filled with moments of high drama. The initial shock of the Hood's destruction, the Bismarck's audacious escape, the critical error by Admiral Lutyens that revealed his position, and the desperate, almost suicidal, attacked by the Swordfish torpedo bombers in gale force winds. The image of the obsolete, fabricated biplanes flying into a wall of anti-aircraft fire to deliver the crippling blow is one of the most enduring of the entire war. It's a tale of technology, tactics, human courage, and pure chance. The final battle was a brutal, one-sided affair. Crippled and surrounded, the Bismarck fought to the last. For over an hour, British battleships and cruisers pounded the German Titan, firing thousands of shells, but the Bismarck's incredible construction meant it refused to sink, even after its guns were silenced and its upper decks were a burning wreck. In the end, it's believed the German crew scuttled the ship to prevent its capture, a final act of defiance. Of the more than 2,200 men aboard, only 115 survived. This immense loss of life on both sides serves as a somber reminder of the human cost of this epic naval confrontation. In the decades since, the Bismarck has transitioned from a weapon of war to a subject of historical fascination and a deep-sea archaeological site. The discovery of its wreck in 1989 by Dr. Robert Ballard, the same man who found the Titanic, answered many questions about its final moments. The wreck lies upright on the seabed, nearly 3 miles down. Remarkably, it is largely intact, a silent testament to the skill of its builders and the violence of its end. The underwater surveys confirmed that the ship absorbed an incredible amount of punishment before it sank, validating its legendary toughness. The discovery also reignited debates about whether it was British firepower or German scuttling that ultimately sent it to the bottom. The consensus now is that both factors played a part. The British shelling destroyed its ability to fight and sealed its fate, while the scuttling charges hastened its final plunge. The wreck of the Bismarck is more than just a rusted hulk. It's a memorial. It is a deep-sea monument to the thousands of men who fought and died in the Battle of the Atlantic, on all sides of the conflict. The legacy of the Atlantic Titan, therefore, is threefold. For the victors, it was a symbol of naval supremacy and a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. For the vanquished, it was a strategic disaster that highlighted the obsolescence of the surface raider and shifted focus to the submarine war. And for history, it remains an unparalleled saga of maritime warfare, a dramatic story of pursuit, battle, and sacrifice. The tale of the Bismarck serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly the tides of war can turn, how technology can change the face of battle overnight, and how the courage and decisions of individuals can shape the course of history on the vast, unforgiving canvas of the open ocean.